Welcome to our guide to classic cameras for the decades, and today we're talking about the 1980s and specifically the second half of the 1980s. If you haven't seen the video on the first half of the 1980s, there'll be a link in the description below. I'm with John Wade, our classics cameras expert, and you're going to talk us through these cameras from your collection.
I am.
Early autofocus, John, so take it away.
Yes, thanks Nigel. Of course it was autofocus. Although it didn't actually start in the 1980s, it sort of started late 70s, 78, 79, with the first autofocus camera, which we won't go into in a great deal of depth because we're talking about the 1980s, but this is the Konica C35 AF, and it was the first camera to actually offer autofocus by something which they called solid state triangulation, was the word for it. And basically it was like an old-fashioned rangefinder that there's two windows. As you press the shutter release, one of the mirrors in the rangefinder began to turn, so the two images from the rangefinder coincided. And the point where they coincided was the point of maximum contrast,
right.
And that was recognised as the focus point. And then the lens whizzed in and took it. So that was the very first autofocus camera. The big thing, of course, was to try and get autofocus into single lens reflexes. And many people are surprised to find that the first person or the first company to produce an autofocus SLR was Polaroid. And they did it with this one. It's called the SX70 Sonar autofocus camera. And you probably recollect Polaroid produced the first SX70 cameras back in 72. And these were the cameras where you press the button on the front, you take the picture, and the print is ejected from the front to self-develop in normal daylight. By 1978, they'd added an autofocus module to it. And what this did was it sent out a sonic beam, which bounced off of the subject, came back, and the length of time it took for it to get back told the lens where to focus. So Polaroid.
So this entire black bit on the top is the sonic.
It is.
The autofocus
It is.
unit.
Yes.
Right.
If you looked at a normal SX70 camera, it's like this without that, basically. And so surprisingly, Polaroid was the first company to produce an autofocus single lens reflex, but with a system that nobody else used afterwards. So really, where it took off in the way we know it now was with Ricoh. If you hear people talking about the coming of autofocus, a lot of people tell you that the first autofocus camera ever was a Pentax, which is this one here, which it was in many ways. This was the first camera which was produced specifically for autofocus, but it wasn't the first autofocus system. That came with Ricoh. This came with Ricoh with a lens called the Rikenon 50mm f2 autofocus lens. And it was a K-mount lens, which would fit onto any K-mount body, which included things like Pentax, more than anything else, Chinon, etc. And all the autofocus mechanism is in the lens itself. So you would simply press a little button on the side. This one won't work because the batteries aren't in it. And it would autofocus. And it worked by much the same sort of system as the Konica. So I've affixed this to an autofocus, to a manual focus Ricoh called the XRS.
Okay.
And if I can digress just for a moment, you might be amazed to find the XRS was the first, and as far as I'm concerned, the last camera to have solar panels each side of the pentaprism hub, which charged the battery. That was the theory. I don't think it
Not going to get very far with that in the UK, are you?
Not a lot.
Probably
no.
Somewhere warmer might work.
No. So I thought it appropriate to put the first autofocus lens on something as strange as the Ricoh XRS.
Have a look at that.
So that's that one.
It's an ugly thing, isn't it?
It is. Most of these early autofocus systems are extremely ugly.
Yeah.
So hot on their heels came Canon. They produced the first autofocus zoom lens. And this is, just hold that for a second, you'll see how heavy it is.
Oh, blimey. Yeah. Obviously, you got it on an A1.
Yes, of course I have.
But you could have put that on any
you can put it, it's an FD mount.
It's sold separately. Yeah.
So you can put it on basically any Canon SLR of that time. But it works very much in the same sort of way. The only difference is it's a 35 to 70mm zoom, which we operate manually there.
Oh, right, okay.
But again, it's got the two windows like a rangefinder.
I presume this hump bit would move around because it's kind of at 45 degrees, isn't it? Was that how it stayed?
No, that's it.
That's
it. Once you've got it in the right place on the lens, on the camera, that's it.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
It looks odd. It looks like the lens isn't mounted properly, doesn't it?
No,
Yeah, it looks like we've got to give it an odd twist.
Yes. That's what you feel like doing.
Right.
But of course, they were very slow as well in those days, and they weren't tremendously accurate. They weren't very good at focusing on plain surfaces. But the wonder is that they worked at all, I suppose, in many ways.
Yeah.
And there were quite a few companies who sort of jumped onto the bandwagon. Pt.2 was one. I haven't got that. This one's a Chinon. This one works in a slightly different way to most. It actually emitted a beam of infrared light, which again bounced off the subject, much like the Polaroid sonic beam, but infrared light. And with that, it could measure how far away the subject was, and once again set the lens at the right focus. And again, all the mechanism is in the lens itself.
Okay.
So that's a Chinon. There are a few.
It's got eyes. Looks like a face, isn't it?
Yes, it's quite attractive actually. I think it's more attractive than some of them.
Now, Chinon was exclusive to Dixon's, wasn't it, in the 80s?
It was.
It was the only place you could buy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So they're progressing along. Canon, who in an earlier video, if anyone has been watching that, saw we were talking about the T series, which actually bridged the gap between compacts and SLRs for people who wanted to make that transition without too much complication. And there was a T50, a T70, a T90, there was a T60 right at the end. And the T80 right in the middle of all of this, strangely, was designed to use an autofocus lens. Perhaps a little bit more compact than some of them.
That came out after this one then?
It did, yes.
Okay, so they managed to shrink it, basically.
Yes. So it was designed as an autofocus camera, but once again, all the mechanism is in the lens itself. And unlike some of the others, there was a range of lenses. This is the standard 50mm lens, and it was also this is a 75-200 zoom. And this one...
You got the complete kit?
Yes. Yeah.
Push-pull zoom.
It is indeed, yes. And this one is a 35-70mm zoom. So you've got standard wide angle and telly, all with autofocus stuff.
Interesting. This is a 35-70, so this is the same lens as that.
Yep.
So it's interesting to compare. So I don't know how many years we're in between these two.
Not a great many, because things were progressing
But how they managed
fast.
to progress.
Yes.
From this to this.
Yes.
Although this is a fixed constant f4.
Yeah.
And this is a 3.5 to 4.5, but I think people would take that sacrifice to get the size difference.
I mean, if you wanted in those days to have an autofocus camera, a one which was built as an autofocus camera, I suppose this would be the thing to have. It's quite neat compared to some.
So the weight difference is you can't really convey in a video.
I mean, this is
just like it's got deep, like C or D size batteries in this.
Yeah, it's ridiculously heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So where does the Pentax ME-F fit into the?
Well, it's sort of intermediary. We dealt with it at this stage because it's a landmark insofar as the camera was made for autofocus lenses. But they were developing that about the same time as all this was going on, and it was only a little while after the Canon add-on lens. Interesting
again that this is the same year,
yes.
81, wasn't it? This one and this one came out, and they're both 35-70 lenses. But again, if you compare the Canon with the Pentax is so much better, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So much better.
Absolutely.
It's so much smaller. And funnily enough, if you were to hold it in a particular way, like this, we cover up the hump. It just looks like a regular ME Super, doesn't it?
It is.
Yeah. I can't imagine Canon when it sold many of these, when these cameras like this were around.
I don't think so. I think there was a panic going on. This came out and everyone thought they better quickly jump on the bandwagon.
And also Canon must have thought, I know, let's make it beige or whatever colour that is.
Yes,
and what were they thinking?
Yes, absolutely. Also, the ME-F can be used with a manual lens.
Right.
It's got focus check in the viewfinder, so you've got two little LEDs, red LEDs, pointing left and right to tell you which way to turn the focusing.
Right. Okay.
And when you're in focus, a little green one in the middle.
Okay,
lights up.
which is good.
So it can be used with a manual lens, but
Yeah.
it was specifically thought it should be used with the autofocus lens.
Yeah.
But at that point, we are still putting the autofocus mechanisms in the lens and also the control. In order to focus, you had to hold it and still press a little button on the side to make it work. Or if you're holding it that way around, there's another button there. The people who, in the last bitch attempt to keep this alive, make it better, was Olympus. Now, I'm sure you remember that back in 1972, the OM1 came out, and then there was the OM2, 3 and 4. And then came the OM10, 20, 30, 40, which was at a more down market area. Well, in the middle of all of that came the OM-30, which was made specifically to use the Olympus autofocus lens, which is what this is.
Right.
And it's an improvement on the Pentax insofar as you could control it from the shutter button. First pressure on the shutter, focus the lens, second pressure, took the picture. And they must have thought they were doing really well there in 1983. This was the way things were going. But unfortunately for them,
Let's have a look at it, isn't it?
in 1985, something completely different happened.
We'll come to that in a minute. But in the meantime, this is a step forward from these ones because you could control the autofocus from the shutter button.
Absolutely.
Whereas you had to press a button on the lens itself.
All of them, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was a completely self-contained unit.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a connection between the lens and the body.
But you still had some sort of power focus on the thing. Yeah.
And then in 1985, Minolta ruined it for everybody else by producing this. And this is the Minolta 7000. And it was the first time that they put the autofocus mechanism in the camera body. So
this was a landmark, wasn't it?
It was very much a landmark. In fact,
did Minolta completely skip the whole lens?
Yes, they did.
Space? They just watched everyone else and thought,
nah. we'll do it better. And I've got written down, and I'll tell you what they said in the publicity material. They said, occasionally in one's lifetime, a startlingly innovative product comes along that changes forever the way things used to be done. This is one of those times. So, and as I say, it's body integral autofocus. The autofocus is in the body, making the lenses a lot more compact and a lot more like a normal SLR. It's a little bit larger than many SLRs at the time, which had been influenced by the Olympus OMs, etc. But it works with any luck.
Yeah. So that's interesting from Minolta's point of view because, as I say, these kind of cameras were, I can imagine, but seeing these sort of big, massive things attached to the lenses was not. I mean, if you really wanted autofocus, it was there. But this just changed everything because you're like, wow, this looks like a normal SLR.
That's right. That's right, and that really changed the state of things.
Yeah. Amazing, and also when people had these, I remember. It was among photography geeks, you know. If you have one of those, people would stop you in the street, and I didn't have one, but I was, you know, I remember stopping someone else and saying, "What is that? A 7000? Can I have a play?" People would want to have a play with it,
That's right,
and they want to press the button and go, "Oh wow, it's amazing." The technology,
even
though the noise is.
I do remember the first time I saw an autofocus SLR was at Pt.2. Can't tell you the year, but Nikon produced a version of their, I think of their F4, was it? Something like that. And I can remember standing in the halls at Pt.2, looking at some lights right down the end of the hall, pressing the button, and everything came into focus. Magic.
It did seem like magic at the time, didn't it? But the noise of it, you frightened birds with that.
Yeah. And that was the 7000, which was aimed principally at the amateur market. Then there was the 9000.
And the styling, again, you're in no doubt at all, they were in the 1980s.
Oh, yes.
Tron and all that.
Yes.
The design, the styling cues, and, you know, early gaming consoles of that period as well. You just look at that.
Very much so,
has that very much that styling, very, very square.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Ultra really grabbed the market there, but unfortunately they didn't hang on to it because then within a couple of years, Canon produced the EOS 650, which was their first camera actually made to be an autofocus camera. Same sort of thing, autofocus, body integral, etc.
And we don't have an EOS 650 here, do we? But it's probably worth mentioning that as being the sort of, it took it to the next level, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
And I think when Canon ditched the FD mount because they realised
It was the first EOS camera, I think, wasn't it?
It was the first EOS camera, yeah. The EOS was designed as an autofocus camera, but I do remember at the time that in order to take it to the next level from what they had, they realised that the mechanical lens mount wasn't going to do it for them. So they introduced this electronic lens mount, the EF mount, which no one else did. And by doing so, they alienated and managed to piss off the entire Canon community who had all their FD lenses, make them really angry that suddenly their systems are obsolete.
Yes.
It's kind of like what's happened with mirrorless now. If you're an EF user and you've got to switch to RF, you know, you've got the whole start again. Alienated them, but by doing so and starting it from scratch, they took such a leap ahead of everybody else in terms of autofocus that no one ever has still not caught up with them. Well, I guess now you'd say that people have caught up slightly, but the market lead that Canon gained by making that very brave decision to switch to EF is a market lead they still have today, isn't it?
Yes.
So
yes, foresight could have all gone wrong, but it didn't.
And I remember I stuck with Nikon, and I had an F4, and the autofocus was like prehistoric compared to the Canon autofocus. And you know, if you were a pro who relied on the autofocus, like you're a sports photographer, I can quite see why so many people jumped ship and switched to Canon because it was light.
I mean, as I was growing up, as it were, Nikon was what everybody aspired to. And suddenly I looked over my shoulder and realised everyone was aspiring to Canon for some reason.
I think it's because of the AF.
Just about the time that I shifted to Nikon.
Well,
And of course, Nikon honoured their mount because the F mount, which came out with it in 1959 with the Nikon F, really was compatible with most stuff all the way through. They brought out the AI version in the 70s and the AIS version a bit later in the 80s with the Nikon FA, etc. But it was still the Nikon F mount.
Yeah, and I think that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to stay loyal to the F mount for the user, which is great, but it did mean that they were behind, I think.
Yes, it held them back.
It did hold them back.
It gave them brand loyalty, but it held them
lost
back.
them their market lead as the brand, you know, for professionals anyway.
So it's a brave step forward for the company that decides to, as Canon did, ditch the past and say, here we are from now on.
And I think that's what happens when you do like embrace the future and say this is the tech and we're going to do the best thing we can now rather than think about then you are going to take that next leap, aren't you?
Yes,
technology-wise.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. Thanks for this guide to early autofocus. Some of these are almost comedic now. If you went out with any of these now, people would probably laugh at you. But it's really interesting to see the autofocus that we take for granted now, where it came from, where it started from.
Absolutely.
So I hope you enjoyed that video, found it interesting. Don't forget to like it if you enjoyed the video. Do give us your comments below what you think of these cameras. Did you own one of these cameras? And what, you know, at the time, what were your thoughts on it? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you don't already. Thanks a lot and see you in the next video.